What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back today to talk about my top 10 favorite fantasy authors who are not named J.R.R. Tolkien. This fall was kind of a crazy time to be a fantasy fan where you had two massive fantasy shows competing against each other at the same time, one of which I loved, House of the Dragon, one of which I hated, Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power. But for fantasy nerds, it was just a time of total bliss because we just got to talk about fantasy all the time and what makes a great adaptation, how could things have been done differently, etc. and so forth. And I miss it. I would say, even though I hated Lord of the Rings of Power, I would welcome its return just to have the excuse to talk more about fantasy, which is why I'm doing this video. And if you followed my channel for a while, you'll notice there's some gaps on the wall behind me because I had to pull a few books down just for discussion purposes for this video. But the reason I'm doing this, or my reasons, are twofold. One, I just want to let people know which fantasy authors that I love and why, and give them all some recommendations. But the second reason is a selfish one. I've discovered so many incredible books over the last 5 or 10 years from recommendations that I've had from on this channel, as well as just on Twitter and other places. I mean, when it comes to fan bases, I don't know if there's a better, I guess, informed and more passionate fan base than those who like to read fantasy books, where they're just so invested. In my entire life, I've considered myself a fantasy fan, but I'd say it's in the last 5 or 10 years where I've discovered the majority of my favorite fantasy authors, because most of the fantasy books that I read as a kid, and this is not an insult to those books, but most of them were almost like marketing materials put out by TSR to help promote some of their campaign settings and fictional settings, and I just ate them up. I mean, I have no idea how many books I read set in the world of Dragonlance or Forgotten Realms or Dark Sun. I mean, I've got some of my old school Dragonlance books from age 10. Actually, let me just pull one of them, pull them out. If you want to see, sorry about this, very unprofessional. A true time capsule from a bygone era. Chronicles 1, 2, and 3, which you can tell are just beaten to death. I got these summer 1987, and they changed my life. And so at age, that summer I turned 11. At that time, I was a rabid fantasy fan, but I wasn't necessarily a well-informed fantasy fan. So what I really want with this video is a dialogue. I want every recommendation you can think of in the comments down below, because 46 now, between now and when I move on to meet my maker, etc. and so forth, I want to read. I don't want there to be a great fantasy book out there that I've not read. That is my goal, and so that mission starts today. And another goal I have with this video is slightly more sinister, but I've noticed a new trend where some people want to like a show, and they want to like it so badly they refuse to listen to any feedback or criticisms from people who are familiar with the works upon which that show or movie might be based, and they call them gatekeepers or lore whores or whatever you want to call them, or whatever term they feel like using. And here's the news. Without the giant fantasy dorks out there who read these books in the first place, we wouldn't have these shows and movies to argue about. Obviously, you need the author first and foremost. That's the most important part of the equation. But when people buy books, that shows executives and producers and studios, etc. Oh, people like these stories. Let's consider adapting them into video games, comics, movies, shows, etc. And so anytime I see a new fan base basically saying like, "You're a bunch of fucking assholes," like just like it, just enjoy it. Like as they say on Red Letter Media, don't ask questions, just consume more product. I just want to tell all those people, fuck off. Like, if somebody tells you that the show Wheel of Time fucking sucks and has a long list of reasons as to why, you are free to disagree, but maybe you should pause to listen. But with that negativity aside, let's pause for a second and define the word fantasy as I understand it. And you can apply fantasy or escapist fantasy to a wide range of genres, and in the end, it just boils down to taste. If you create a futuristic setting with spaceships, aliens, and laser guns, but also have magic and dragons and that sort of thing, like, at what point does it cease to be fantasy and become science fiction, or vice versa, etc. and so forth? For me, fantasy tends to have a more sword and sorcery angle, like less fairy tale, but more wizards, dragons, etc. But I think one important distinction that we have to call attention to is the difference between fantasy and mythology. And I found this great article from April 16th, 2021 over at swordandboard.gg/blog, where it opens as such. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Hades and Persephone, Beowulf, 1001 Arabian Nights. What do they have in common? Now consider The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, The Chronicles of Narnia, A Song of Ice and Fire. What do they have in common? The former list is all folklore and mythology, the latter list, fantasy. They all fall under the large umbrella that is fiction, but while there is some overlap between the two, it is important to know the distinctions, especially if you want to review or write fantasy or put a new take on an old myth. If you look at the second list again, you can probably name each of the authors involved without much thinking. Tolkien, Rowling, Lewis, Martin. Who wrote the first list? If you're drawing a blank, good. It is the most fundamental, easily accessible difference between fantasy stories and myths. Fantasy stories are able to be traced to an author or named a group of them, generally speaking. Mythologies are stories that predate our fantasy genre. So while the Iliad might be the greatest fantasy story ever written, it will not be included on this list because I regard that as mythology. And some people might say, well, that's friggin' Homer. You've got the Iliad right up there on your shelf. It's an arbitrary distinction, I know, but I do place mythology into a different category. And then make the waters even muddier. Some might say, well, Neil Gaiman's a fantasy author. What about a book like Norse mythology? He's taking old myths, but telling it in his own words. And to that, I would just say, you got me. I love Norse mythology. I've read it twice, but it will not be included on this list because I regard it as mythology, not fantasy. And that book gets my highest possible recommendation, meaning that at some point I'm just going to have to come back and talk about my top 10 favorite myths, whether that be friggin' Egyptian or Norse or Greek or whatever the case might be. Now, before I get to my official top 10 of these authors, I should go ahead and give a few honorable mentions, as well as mention from the outset a few people who are not on this list who probably should be, but I've just not read their stuff yet. I've heard the Earthsea books by Ursula K. Le Guin are incredible. I read her book Left Hand to Darkness, but I've not read the Earthsea book, so they won't be making this list, nor will Ursula K. Le Guin, but I do plan on reading that. And I've heard Master and Margarita is an absolute masterpiece with the kind of Russian fantasy, or at least I think it's Russian fantasy. Lies of Locke Lamore I've heard is amazing. Carl Edward Wagner's novels of Cain I heard are just absolutely riveting sword and sorcery. Sadly, I've not yet read them. Terry Goodkind's Sword of Truth series I've not yet read, but now we come to my honorable mentions where either I've read some of their stuff but have not yet made up my mind, like Brandon Sanderson, one of the most popular fantasy authors in the world. I've read his 3 Wheel of Time books, and I have the final Wheel of Time book, A Memory of Light, right here, which I loved. But for people who don't know, after Robert Jordan died, he had a bunch of scraps and fragments of how he wanted to wrap up his Wheel of Time series, and Brandon Sanderson was brought in to basically give it form and structure. Wrote 3 books that are pretty goddamn good. I mean, the series ended on a high note, but Brandon Sanderson will not be making this list because I've not yet read any of his big standalone books. And I've got, what the hell is that one called? Way of Kings. Ready to rock at a moment's notice, but who knows? If I do a part 2 of this list, Brandon Sanderson will probably be on it. But just spoiler alert, Robert Jordan will be on this list. But Fritz Leiber is another author where he should be on this list. And I've read Ill Met at Lankmar like 3 times. I think it's one of the greatest fantasy stories I've ever read. I mean, it is like the best sword and sorcery mixed with like the best Lovecraftian horror you can imagine, and introduces some really incredible characters. And I've read a few other of his stories where the Grey Mouser and Fafford were on solo adventures, but I need to read a lot more Fritz Leiber before I include him on this list. Stephen King. I see a lot of Stephen King up here. Eyes of the Dragon is one of my favorite fantasy novels from my childhood. I read it twice. The Dark Tower series obviously has tons of fantasy ingredients. I mean, The Gunslinger is basically a fantasy book with a revolver, and I love his fantasy stuff, but I do regard Stephen King as more of a horror writer, and so he will not be on this list. Neil Gaiman. I've read a ton of his comics, read his Sandman series, and as I mentioned before, I read Norse mythology, and I've seen movies and shows based on his work, like Good Omens, but the sad truth is I've read too few of Neil Gaiman's fantasy books to have a firm grasp of his oeuvre, if that's how you say that word, to include him on here. So with all that out of the way, let's dive into things. And I must confess, this is my second attempt at doing this video. The first time I got so lost in the weeds trying to summarize the stories of these authors that I realized the video would be 12 hours long. And maybe one day I'll do a giant documentary series on fantasy novels and that sort of thing. But I'm going to try to keep this list down to the author's name, which books I've read, which are my favorites, very brief summary of what they might be about. But otherwise, I'll be here all goddamn day and my voice just will not last that long. But with all that bullshit out of the way, let's start working our way through my official list. And we're basically going to go from A to S because it's just too painful trying to rank them from 10 down to 1, because if you were to ask me my opinion 5 minutes later, I would probably change my mind. So just J.R.R. Tolkien, he is the god of fantasy fiction, and I imagine that position will remain unchallenged for a very, very long time. But in that I spent all fall ranting and raving about how much I love J.R.R. Tolkien's work, I feel like I've kind of done my due diligence on that front. So let's dive right into Joe Abercrombie. You can see 10 of his books on this shelf behind me. He's one of those authors where I've read most of his books. He's got another series of 3 that's more of like a young adult series that I've not read any of. But finally, I'm going to get a chance to set the record straight because I've seen a lot of people make this mistake, including my dear younger brother. And I don't know how this started, but a lot of people read his First Law trilogy, and then a lot of people skip ahead and read his Age of Madness trilogy, and they seem to think that Best Served Cold, The Heroes, and Red Country are like disposable or immaterial. From my point of view, Best Served Cold, The Heroes, and Red Country, that's the heart of this series. Those are the best books in this series. They're the nastiest, they're the meanest. And The Heroes is easily the most addictive. The Heroes was so goddamn good that I basically had it in my lap for like a day and a half until I finished it, because if I had an opportunity to read a few sentences, I would. And so I don't know which writers or commentators got this trend started where you would only read the first trilogy and the last trilogy and nothing in between. But I just want to say that it's worth reading every single book in the First Law franchise, including his collection of short stories, Sharp Ends, which kind of fleshes in the gaps on some of these characters as well. But without diving into all the characters I love and all the stories that I love, all I'll say is this is the best version that I've seen of a kind of low fantasy world that used to be a high fantasy world shifting into an industrial fantasy world. And some would say, well, Tolkien already did that with some of the industrialization that you see at play in Mordor. And yeah, fair play. He absolutely was tackling industrialization in the context of his books. But Joe Abercrombie does it very explicitly. And for a while there, he was writing a book a year. Now he's pausing to write a fresh trilogy in a fresh setting. So we got to wait a little while. But at any rate, I've said enough about Joe Abercrombie at this point. He fucking rocks. Definitely hunt down his books. But let's move on to R. Scott Bakker, who's one of my favorite fantasy authors, but also one of my most hated fantasy authors. Not because he's not good. I mean, he's fascinating. I would say that his style of writing, I've never encountered an author where I could safely say that like their style of fantasy appeals directly to my tastes and sensibilities, and in a lot of ways kind of informed and helped shape my tastes and sensibilities. But if authors were to take requests and say like, what if there's any ongoing series that is unfinished that you would want to see more of, I would say please give me 3 or 4 more R. Scott Bakker books that are as good as his best work, because I'm dying to know more. But he has a bad habit of leaving people lingering for years and or ending books on cliffhangers that are incredibly frustrating and irritating. So the last few years I have been embroiled with a lot of rage towards R. Scott Bakker. However, I must confess that he has written 7 absolutely extraordinary fantasy novels, as well as some really cool short stories on his website, like The False Sun. But his Prince of Nothing trilogy and his Aspect Emperor Quartet, how can I even put this into words? Imagine a really rich, sophisticated, fascinating fantasy setting where basically something resembling like a living spaceship travels through dimensions and crashes into that world, bringing the most horrible abominations and just monstrosities that you can imagine. And basically, what are the consequences of these two civilizations colliding in terms of knowledge and technology, et cetera, and so forth. And some of you are going to say, "What? Wait a second. I thought you said no science fiction is going to be included on this list." The way these creatures are portrayed, it's pure fantasy. Nothing about it is going to feel like science fiction. Or maybe that's just my own personal bias. But what's fascinating is how that interaction leads to a first apocalypse from which the civilization barely recovers from, and the whole series is building towards a second apocalypse, and which people want to usher it in and which people want to stop it. And I just find this series to be mesmerizing. It's so goddamn eerie and savage and otherworldly and almost painfully philosophical and opaque at times, where it borders on being incomprehensible. But it's got killer characters, phenomenal combat. The magic system is probably the best magic system of any fantasy series that I've ever encountered. And also, I feel like R. Scott Bakker is sadly relatively unknown apart from a few diehard fans, which is probably why he's not been writing any more books, because the sales just aren't that great. So if I could accomplish one thing with this video, it would be get people to read at least the initial trilogy, the Prince of Nothing trilogy, starting with The Darkness That Comes Before, culminating in The Thousandfold Thought. And that's all I've got to say about him. But let's move on to Steven Erikson. So Steven Erikson, this fucker probably requires more work from the reader than any other fantasy author that I've ever come across. His series is called Malazan Book of the Fallen, and he's written, I think, 10 books in this series, and he's got a partner in crime who's also written other novels and short stories set in that world, and it's all loosely based on this tabletop RPG experience they shared, I think, back in the early 80s. I've only read the first 3 books in this series, Gardens of the Moon, Deadhouse Gates, and Memories of Ice, all of which I found to be absolutely riveting, but they were also so dense and so incomprehensible that I spent more time kind of looking up what the words mean and who the characters are and that sort of thing than I actually did just reading and enjoying the novel. If you believe that a fantasy novel, you should be able to sit down on a couch and just open it up and read it from cover to cover and have a great experience, Steven Erikson is not going to be the author for you, because you could probably read Gardens of the Moon and get to the end of it and be like, I have no idea what the fuck I just read. I mean, like I said, it is bordering on impenetrable. However, there's a certain, I guess, like tipping point where suddenly the world and the characters and the system of gods and wizards, etc. and so forth, you understand enough of it where you can appreciate these moments of high fantasy. And I feel like it's very much in vogue these days for authors to indulge in low fantasy, where you basically have a medieval setting with 1 or 2 tiny little leftover magical details from a bygone era, but for the most part, it's just kind of grimdark and kind of ruthless. Steven Erikson leans all the way in to magic and people being imbued with the power of gods and so on and so forth. If you want to see your fantasy characters wielding the power of like badass superheroes and going to war and like flying around and flying castles and that sort of thing, Steven Erikson is definitely the author for you. And I will read book 4 at some point, but I basically have to brace myself and save up my energy and powers of concentration before I crack open any of his books. But let's move on to one of the key figures in the fantasy genre, the great Robert E. Howard. And if you don't know who that is, all I'll say is Conan. And Conan is not the only character that he created, but the Hyborian Age and that world and those nations and those characters, there are a few fictional settings that's instantly recognizable that have such a distinctive, unique style as the lands that Conan gets to explore in these short stories. There's no flavor quite like it, and I have a collection up here which collects every single short story with Conan, and I've read almost all of them at this point. And I'm a big believer in reading these stories in chronological order in terms of the order in which they were published, as opposed to trying to organize them chronologically. Because he didn't write them in a chronological fashion. Sometimes Conan would be old, sometimes he would be young, and I find it fascinating kind of dipping in and out of different points in his life. But goddamn, when it comes to, when I mentioned earlier about R. Scott Bakker writing stories for my specific tastes and preferences, Robert E. Howard is right there with Bakker, where a story like The Scarlet Citadel or The Tower of the Elephant or Red Nails, these are some of the best goddamn fantasy stories that have ever been written, and you can sit down on the couch and be in and out in like 20 or 30 minutes. They're just complete and total sheer bliss. And what makes these tales of high adventure so distinctive is there's an underlying philosophy flowing through these where you have a quote-unquote savage interacting with civilization with mixed results. And I find the contrast fascinating where Conan's always making these comments about how like civilized people say horrible things because they never expect somebody to basically stab them or hit them as punishment, but Conan comes from a civilization where you are forced to be more respectful because if you insult people or insult their honor, well, they're going to bash your goddamn brains in. But seeing this quote-unquote savage who basically starts out with like a loincloth and nothing else, slowly working his way up to becoming not only a king, but a great king, like a really effective king, where when you hear the way he describes his loyalty to his people and what he's trying to do for them, like, wow, like somebody's evolved and come a long way. And I just find the character so noble and so honorable. And it's led to so many other creators being inspired by this world, whether you're talking about Frank Frazetta's paintings, which absolutely beautifully capture this world, or a movie like John Milius's Conan the Barbarian from 1982, which admittedly is pulling from a bunch of different influences, from his interest in Mongolian history to his love of Russian cinema, movies like Alexander Nevsky. I mean, Conan the Barbarian is not a pure distillation of Robert E. Howard's stories, but it is a complete and total work of art and one of the great fantasy films that has ever been made. And like the character of Conan, that movie is unique. It is one of a kind.
Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women. That is good. That is good.
And the good news is I still have a ton of Robert E. Howard left to read. I've never read any of his Cull stories. I've never read any of his Solomon Kane stories. And sadly, he died very young, but he left behind a giant body of work. And if you haven't read any Robert E. Howard, get on it. You can't go wrong. Just, pick up Conan the Cimmerian, which is, I think, like the first 10 or 15 of the short stories in the order in which they were published, and it will keep you busy for a very long time. But before I actually got going, I mentioned Robert Jordan. So let's get back into Robert Jordan. Robert Jordan probably wrote more fantasy than any fantasy author who ever lived. You can see the first 6 books in the Wheel of Time series over my left shoulder. And most of those books are from my senior year of high school when I first discovered his work. And I love those first 6 books so much that I read them twice. But as I was discovering that world, that was the first time I realized, there might be more than just, there might be more great authors out there than just J.R.R. Tolkien. Maybe there are many legendary writers, and maybe I have a lot more to look forward to. And the one thing I have to admit in advance that if you get sucked into the Wheel of Time, it's a total of 15 books all in if you include the prequel, New Spring. But 2 things you have to be warned about in advance. There's a period that comes around book 7 or book 8, depending upon how loyal to the series you are, that many people refer to as the slog. And the slog lasts, for me, books 8 through 10. Path of Daggers, Winter's Heart, Crossroads of Twilight. They have their moments that are epic and amazing, but it's with Knife of Dreams, book 11, where the series really gets back on firm footing, and then Brandon Sanderson swooped in for books 12, 13, and 14 to help kind of give it a satisfying conclusion after Robert Jordan unfortunately died. So if you can handle the fact that there's a slog, and if you can handle the fact that Robert Jordan did not finish it personally, I strongly recommend you read The Wheel of Time, because the climax to Lord of Chaos, book 6, is one of the most satisfying battle scenes in all of fantasy literature. I would even go so far as to say, if you were to just read the first 6 books and then just leave it alone and let your imagination fill in the gaps, that would be fine as well. Those first 6 books, Robert Jordan, there was just lightning going through his fingertips at that time. So ignore the show. The show's a complete and total failure in every way, shape, or form. And just brace yourself for one of the most immersive, richly detailed fantasy environments ever created by a human being. And yeah, you'll love it. So before I go any further, I'm going to say something which might be controversial to some, but I don't think it will be controversial to those who actively read fantasy today. But I think the fantasy genre might be better than ever. Like, there might be more good authors working in the fantasy genre right now than at any other point in the last 100 years. And you could probably say, anyway, people can fight all day about their favorite periods, but I don't know why. Something about The popularity of George R.R. Martin's series in the 90s spawned a whole host of imitators in the grimdark space, but one author took the idea of grimdark and took it a few steps further, where they actually made a legit villain the star of their first trilogy. And I'm not talking about a villain who's like a lovable rogue who, steals from the rich to give to the poor and like gives ladies a kiss on the cheek and then goes home. I'm talking about an actual villain who will lead a band of thugs into a village and put all the men to the sword, sell the children into slavery, rape the women, and then burn the village down. Like a villain, like a medieval era Dark Ages villain. And I'm talking about Mark Lawrence's Broken Empire trilogy. A trilogy which I think starts to fade, but the good news is he's got other trilogies set in the world. I just started Prince of Fools, which is book 4, which is the beginning of another trilogy, which is then followed by yet another trilogy, which I hear is the best of all of them. But when I started reading the Broken Empire trilogy, which begins with Prince of Thorns from 2011, within like 2 pages, I was like, oh my God, like he did it. Like he's going there. This is not a misunderstood victim. This is not a misunderstood person who had a troubled childhood. He had, up to a point, like the best childhood imaginable before this horrible event happened to him, which kind of set him on a different path. But he's an actual villain capable of committing the most unspeakable atrocities imaginable. In this first series, Prince of Thorns, King of Thorns, and then Emperor of Thorns. I loved it. Although I must admit, I liked each book less than the one that came before. But Prince of Fools... Anyway, it's a very different style, very different tone, and I'm enjoying the hell of it. But if you are craving fantasy that's willing to go to the dark side, pick up Prince of Thorns. You will not be disappointed. Yeah, I guess of all the fantasy authors who are willing to explore and go to the dark side, George R.R. Martin will dip his toes in there. R. Scott Bakker will dip his toes in there. Robert E. Howard will dip his toes in there. But Mark Lawrence just swims around in there and just eats it up. So definitely hunt down Prince of Thorns. But moving on, we've got Mr. George R.R. Martin himself. And if you've not yet read A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms or even heard of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, it's a collection of 3 novellas that are set in Westeros right before the beginning of A Song of Ice and Fire. One of his lesser-known books, but well worth hunting down. But obviously, George R.R. Martin is one of the most successful fantasy authors who has ever lived. The HBO shows spawned by his books, it's just a media empire. And while the Game of Thrones show fell off hard toward the end, House of the Dragon brought it all right back up. Fire and Blood, absolutely riveting. Song of Ice and Fire, I mean, I don't think we're ever going to see a conclusion to that series. We've had 5 books. Each book has taken longer to publish. I mean, the first 3, boom, boom, boom. They came out all in a row. There's a little break for A Feast for Crows, a little break for A Dance with Dragons, but now we've been waiting 11 years for The Winds of Winter. And when you hear George R.R. Martin speak publicly, I mean, he's kind of becoming a soft-spoken, quiet, older gentleman. And I just don't know if he's got the vitality and the fire and the energy and the enthusiasm to finish Winds of Winter and finish A Dream of Spring before he moves on to Westeros Heaven. So that will always be the black mark next to his name, because when people ask you, like, well, should I start reading the George R.R. Martin books, A Song of Ice and Fire, or start watching Game of Thrones, you always have to tell them, well, the books are incredible, but there's no ending, or the show's incredible, but has a shitty ending. But I think now with House of the Dragon, as good as it is, and we probably have 2 or 3 more amazing seasons coming our way, and Fire and Blood being so satisfying, it's safe to say that George R.R. Martin is one of the greatest fantasy novelists who's ever lived, one of the most satisfying. I've read all 5 of the Song of Ice and Fire books twice. Love them. I've read Fire and Blood twice. I'm about to start A Knight of Seven Kingdoms for a second time, but thank you, G.R.R.M., for giving us so much insanely good entertainment over the last 25 years, because the world he's created, I think it'll continue to inspire storytellers and artists and painters and filmmakers and television writers for many more years to come. And I just look forward to season 2 of House of the Dragon. Hopefully we won't have to wait too long. But let's get a little more old school with Mr. Michael Moorcock. And the only thing I've read by him is this collection, The Stealer of Souls, which are the original stories about Elric of Melniboné, starting with the story The Dreaming City. And The Dreaming City is one of those short stories that has everything I want from the fantasy genre. I would put it up there with a story like Fritz Leiber's Ill Met at Lankmar or Red Nails by Robert E. Howard. There's certain fantasy short stories where you're just like, I cannot believe how perfect this little tale happens to be, but goddamn, Michael Moorcock and his character, Elric, is he's one of the most influential fantasy characters ever created, where you can see him popping up in comics and other fantasy stories or variations on him from his look, like basically being either an albino or really pale with like silver or white hair. I mean, you could even say the Targaryens are loosely influenced by Elric. Actually, now that I say that, very influenced by Elric and the royal family that he comes from, and how they used to have access to all this dark magic that they no longer have access to. But you look at Marvel Comics, someone like Adam Warlock and his Soul Gem, clearly inspired by Elric. Or look at the Dragonlance series, Raistlin Magir, clearly inspired by Elric of Menibene, where you have somebody who's physically frail trying to wield magic that is beyond their ability to contain or wield safely. Or even Geralt of Rivia. I mean, Geralt of Rivia in the Witcher series, you're coming from a very different Polish tradition for those fantasy stories, but something tells me at some point Andrzej Sapkowski read Michael Moorcock. So in this collection of all the stories that came from 1961 to 1964, which is 9 tales, starting with the Dreaming City, ending with the Doomed Lord's Passing, and all these appeared in the magazine Science Fantasy, like I said, from 61 to 64. And it's basically short stories and novellas. But goddamn, it is so damn satisfying. But the good news is, in 1972, he circled back and started filling in the gaps in his fictional setting, because he'd ended the world by 1964, but people wanted more stories about Elric. And so in 1972, he published a novel about how Elric first found his sword, Stormbringer. So that is what I'm going to read next. But if you just want to have a self-contained book that captures basically the entire beginning, middle, and end of a character in its world, you can just read that and be very, very satisfied. But luckily, I still got a few more stops to make on my journey with Michael Moorcock. Now, in order to celebrate the next author on my list, I have to contradict myself, or something that I said earlier, where I said I wasn't going to include any author where I hadn't read enough of their work to have a really firm grasp or understanding of what they've done. But what do you do with a great fantasy author who's only written 2 books? One of which I've read, and I just read recently, The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. And it was so goddamn good. I think that he will always be included on any list of great fantasy authors. But is it fair for me to include him? No, I'm breaking my own rules, but the book was so goddamn good, I have no choice. So The Name of the Wind came out in 2008. It's the beginning of the King Killer Chronicles, and the premise is just so juicy. Imagine a writer sitting down with somebody who's got a lifetime of great adventures behind them, where they are one of the most fascinating people imaginable in terms of just through the power of their intellect, accomplished so many incredible things. A figure of controversy, a figure who has all sorts of forbidden knowledge, a figure who's a musician and a romantic and an alchemist. And basically, like, what if you could find a fictional setting like Harry Potter, but geared toward an adult sensibility? A big chunk of The Name of the Wind is like that, where you have somebody learning and accumulating all the skills that will turn them into a legendary figure. But usually in fantasy stories, you either have someone like real simple and innocent, like a hobbit in the J.R.R. Tolkien stories, or you've got like badass warriors and that sort of thing. It's rare where you find somebody where they're just real goddamn smart. The central character in The Name of the Wind, he's able to absorb new skills and information very quickly. And it makes him arrogant. It makes him kind of a piece of shit, but it also makes him just adorable because he's so goddamn cocky about his abilities. So I'm going to wait to read book 2 until I know for certain that book 3 is coming. And when that gets a release date or a publication date, then I will continue with the series. But it's just too heartbreaking waiting for more books to come out, an unfinished series. But as a standalone book, Name of the Wind absolutely delivers. And at last, we come to the 10th and final author on my list, and I'm going to go with Andrzej Sapkowski and his Witcher series. I've only read the first 3 books, Last Wish and Sword of Destiny, which are just an astonishing collection of short stories, and then the novel Blood of Elves. And I have a weird relationship with this series right now because I thought the video game Witcher 3 was one of the best I've ever played. I thought these 3 books were some of the best fantasy stories I've ever read. But I've kind of fallen out of love with The Witcher, at least in the short term, for a variety of reasons. I thought season 1 on the Netflix show it had a couple of good episodes, and those good episodes were those that very closely adhered to some of the short stories in those first 2 collections. And then before season 2 came out, I kept seeing the showrunner talking about how, oh, we love Blood of Elves, and everyone in our writing staff had to read Blood of Elves, and we're gonna adapt Blood of Elves. And then this season came out, and it just sucked. Like, the first episode was based on a short story from the first 2 books, and then they proceeded just to take Blood of Elves and be like, oh, thanks, but no thanks, threw it over the shoulder, and just started inventing the most mundane, bland, generic, predictable, just interchangeable fantasy stories you've ever seen. And the only thing that kept me on board at all for a couple of episodes was Henry Cavill. And now we've subsequently learned from a writer/producer on the new, what the hell is that? Anyway, there's a guy who's working on this new X-Men animated show who was on the writing staff of The Witcher, and he said that it blew his mind just how many people on the writing staff hate the books and hate the video game, and basically almost, you could probably say, hate the fan base that they're trying to cater to, and that's why the show has flown off the rails. And recently also, Henry Cavill bailed on the role. He's in season 3, but the rumor is that he got tired of always trying to pull the show back to what made these stories and the games so compelling. So I will likely read book 4 before season 3 just so that I can bitch accurately about all the things that they get wrong. But I don't know, I might be done with that show entirely and just focus on finishing Sapkowski's entire series, because he's an incredible fantasy writer. And I would say most of the fantasy stories that I've read are more or less like Western European style fantasy stories that come from a tradition of things like King Arthur or Norse mythology, whatever the case might be. It's cool seeing fantasy from an Eastern European philosophy because it's just a very different sensibility. It's different creatures, it's different beliefs, and I just find it fascinating, and it shows how great fantasy can come from anywhere. And Andrzej Sapkowski is just yet another one of those fantasy writers that I've discovered in recent years. Like I said at the beginning of the video, most of these authors I've discovered in like the last 10 years. So as a fantasy fan, I feel very well fed these days. But before I wrap up this video, I just want to apologize to all the fantasy nerds out there who have read more fantasy novels than I have, who are like, how come you don't have this fucker on here? How come you don't have this fucker on here? Please leave me recommendations. I will read all of them. I like reading a couple new fantasy books every year. And I don't ever want to be able to bump into anyone ever and have them recommend a great fantasy book that I've not read. That is my goal. So if you want to leave a list of 100 recommendations down below, you will not bother me in the slightest. That was the purpose of this video. Now, before I turn the camera off, because Christmas is right around the corner and you might be thinking about buying some of these books for your friends and loved ones for Christmas, but I'm going to ask that you consider going over to manscaped.com and making a purchase with the discount code WRONGREEL in all caps, because Manscaped is the official sponsor of my podcast, Wrong Reel. If you want to hear a podcast about film history, definitely check it out. But here is the official, request or ad from the good folks over at Manscaped. This holiday season, I'll be giving thanks to our friends over at Manscaped. Everyone loves turkey and stuffing, but you'll be looking like dessert with the help of Manscaped's Performance Package 4.0. The leaders in below-the-waist grooming have blessed you with the ultimate Thanksgiving dinner topic. Tell your in-laws about your new cutting-edge ball trimmer and gift yourself or the man in your life the ultimate men's hygiene bundle. Trim your pumpkins by going to manscaped.com and using the discount code WRONGREEL in all caps for free shipping and 20% off. Inside, you'll find the Lawnmower 4.0 trimmer, Weed Whacker ear and nose hair trimmer, Crop Preserver ball deodorant, Crop Reviver toner, Performance Box briefs, those are my particular faves, and a travel bag to hold your goodies. Think of it as a cornucopia for your balls. So I'll leave a link down in the description below to how to get to Manscaped, but I can't thank you enough for sticking with me for this lengthy rant about fantasy books. I hope you enjoyed. Consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, maybe even sharing the video with your friends. But thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoy some of these authors if you happen to check them out. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.